Hi, I'm Matt, and welcome to Tech Tested. Today we're going to be testing a computer we built a couple videos ago, so come along the ride with us to see how an old Sandy Bridge 8-core does today. So if you didn't watch our last video, we can link it down in the description and up here somewhere. But essentially what we did was we found on AliExpress a whole platform, an 8-core CPU with motherboard and 32 gigabytes of RAM for $200, so we had to test it out. So we built this computer in that last video, and today we're going to show you our benchmark results. We need to throw out a couple disclaimers. First, there are two methods to benchmarking components. First method is comparing it to other components in the market, and the second method is benchmarking it against an industry standard such as the gaming industry standard of 60 frames per second. We will be utilizing the latter method mainly because I don't have all the other components to test right now. Second disclaimer is right now I am relearning how to do all the proper benchmarking. So what we did for this computer is we used canned benchmarks and the results from those. In future videos, we're going to do more precise measurements, but in this video, this will at least give you some idea of the gaming performance you can expect out of this 8-core CPU. First up is one of my favorites. It's Cinebench R15, and that is just a classic benchmark to see what your single core and multi-core performance is gonna be. And our single core performance came out to 131. Now, a while ago, I would have said 100 is the bare minimum for gaming performance, but nowadays I think that threshold has definitely increased. And another thing to keep in mind is that in single core performance, this processor throttles all the way up to 3.8 gigahertz. But if there's a multi-core load, it throttles back to 3.3 gigahertz. So if you're running any other programs on your computer while gaming, it's gonna throttle that single core performance even lower than the 131 performance that we're getting in this benchmark. Our multi-core R15 score turned out to be 1,138, which that is less than 100 per thread and just over 100 per core. And not really the performance we're looking for from a processor like this, so this isn't a great start for our little 8-core. Next up is Cinebench R20. Now, our single-threaded score was 271 and our multi-threaded score was 2,399. To put that into perspective, a more modern Ryzen 7 3700X almost doubled our single-threaded score, and it actually over doubled our multi-threaded score. Now you have to keep into consideration the price. This whole platform was $200, and just the processor for the Ryzen is 50% more than that, but that's still a huge performance delta. Moving on to Firestrike, our physics score came in at just over 14,000. The problem also comes in when you consider that a Ryzen 3700X is 10,000 points higher than that. That's a huge difference, and you're gonna see that trend continue in some of these tests. Moving on to TimeSpy, our physics score was 5987, but again, the Ryzen 7 3700X definitely beats it with another 50% performance delta. Now we're gonna get into gaming benchmarks. All of our settings were set to 1080p at very low details in order to stress primarily our CPU. We also used my 5700 XT in all the previous benchmarks, as well as all the subsequent benchmarks, just so we can make sure that we are not getting any GPU bottlenecks. So in Rise of the Tomb Raider, we got an average frame rate of 115 frames per second. Now that is a very single-threaded CPU intensive benchmark. While running the test, we saw 2 of the 16 threads skyrocket while most of the other threads stayed primarily unutilized. This is definitely an example of a CPU bottleneck, but at 115 frames per second, that's really not bad. Moving on to Ashes of the Singularity, that's a great one to stress your CPU, and we definitely saw more CPU stress, where in DirectX 11 mode, our maximum frame rate was 63 frames per second, and in DirectX 12 mode, where it spread all that workload across the entire workbench, it was only 37 frames per second. Now keep in mind, in DirectX 11 mode on Ashes of the Singularity, you can only do a GPU-based stress test, whereas in the DirectX 12 mode, we did a CPU-based stress test, so that is definitely gonna account for some of the delta. That also goes to show us how CPU-bound we are in a more modern RTS game. Moving on to Far Cry 5. Our average frame rate was 90 frames per second and our minimum was 72 frames per second. Again, definitely CPU bound, but that's still above the industry standard, so to speak, of 60 frames per second. If you're gaming at 144 Hertz, you're definitely gonna be a little bit disappointed, but I'm guessing if you're looking at a $200 platform, you're probably not gaming at 144 Hertz anyway. If you've been disappointed up to this point, then Dirt 3 might put a little bit of a smile on your face because we got an average frame rate of 266 frames per second and a minimum of 197. So if you're gonna be playing an older game like Dirt 3 that is much more graphically intensive than CPU intensive, you will be pretty satisfied with this platform. All right, that's the end of our benchmarks, and we had to end on a good note with Dirt 3. Now it's time for a conclusion. I really want to recommend this platform because it was a lot of fun to work with, but unfortunately, the locked nature of this particular Xeon is really disappointing, and even though it's only $200, it's a dead platform. You can't really upgrade past this, and for $250, you can at least get started on a modern platform, but I will make a recommendation. If you already have your own DDR3 memory, I recommend getting an unlocked 6-core Xeon, the E5-1650, and a motherboard that is capable of overclocking that Xeon. That way you can get better single-core performance for gaming while retaining most of those threads for other workloads such as rendering or video editing. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, follow us on all of our social media platforms, and join us on our new Discord channel where you can interact with us, other tech-tested viewers, play games, and discuss computer hardware. Is that it? Oh, hi.